Actually, there is a fourth city in the title that I added afterwards. It's Colonus, Athens, Rome, and Pavia, as you will soon see. When I was invited to this conference, for which many thanks, and learned it was going to be entitled Dive Deeper, I thought I would call my talk Die Deeper. It was, in a way, too beautiful a title in the context of this conference and in the light of Michael Paul Gallagher's own life. But alas, it means nothing in English, at least if one looks at it from the point of view of traditional grammar and syntax. How can one die deeper or more deeply? If you were in the Middle Ages and with Dante, it might mean that second eternal death to which mortal unrepented sin brings you and for which you are punished in hell. And that was certainly not what I had in mind, nor what Michael would think I had in mind. What I have in mind is a way of dying that shows us something deeper than the simple stopping of heart, lungs, and brain in some of the flesh, and suggests whatever else might be associated with it. I have chosen antiquity, which is almost 1,000 years of dying, in the spirit, as it were, of Simone Weil's Intuition pré-chrétienne, which is a beautiful book, I'm sure you know, published in 1951, I think out in English as well. When in 1975, Michael, together with Monsignor Tom White, married my wife and myself in the University Church, Dublin, he did not know I was at heart such a staunch pagan. 20 years later, I had written the last chapter on the New Testament of my book on rewritings of the Bible, which in Italian was entitled Riscritture. I gave it to him to read and see if there was any error in it, by which I meant both a factual error and a doctrinal one. In other words, something heretical. In Rome, you can end up on a pyre for heresy, as you know. In London, you're safer, I think. And therefore, I will be heretic. No, I won't. A couple of months later, Michael came to dinner and pronounced this sentence. No, there were no errors. The chapter was solid, he said, and indeed beautiful, but a bit Protestant. I think I know what he meant. It was not Protestant, it was Greek, or at most Roman, or both. I was writing from the perspective of an enlightened pagan in the 4th century AD. And this, I am afraid, is the perspective you are going to get from me in today's talk. So, here we go. We begin with a play presumably composed in the year 406 BC, Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus. Sophocles wrote it at the age of 90, which is rather marvelous because you can find very few artists who are still active and indeed wonderful at that age. Shortly before his death, in the winter of 406-405 BC. And this, as well as the fact that Colonus had been his birthplace, might of course have some bearing on the major themes of the play. The static quality of Oedipus at Colonus, nothing really major happens, or things do happen, but it never moves from there, is part of a structure that already the ancients considered splendid and nearly unique, they said. Its plot is made of words and aura, of lines where an echo resounds that is earthly and otherworldly, historical and mythical, political, ethical, and metaphysical. Let me remind you of what that play is about. Old and blind, accompanied by his daughter Antigone, and joined immediately afterwards by his other daughter Ismene, Oedipus reaches, after a long life of exile and wandering, the grove sacred to the Eumenides in the village of Colonus, just outside Athens. He knows this is the place where destiny has decreed he should die, and he asks the citizens of Colonus to shelter him from any possible attack. He also asks that the ruler of Athens, Theseus, protect his and his daughter's lives. In exchange, he will be the protector of Athens after his death. Shelter is not granted immediately, for when the inhabitants of Colonus learn who has arrived in the city, they are horrified and would have him leave immediately. Oedipus, they know, is he who killed his father, Laius, and married his mother, Jocasta, with whom he had 4 children, the boys Polynices and Eteocles, and the girls Antigone and Ismene, who are thus also his brothers and sisters. Sophocles had staged a terrifyingly tragic story, lending its plot the quality of an amazing time bomb 20 years earlier in Oedipus Rex. And in the first section of Oedipus at Colonus, he has those events recalled by the chorus representing the citizens of Colonus. When pressed, Oedipus confirms he is indeed guilty of parricide and incest, but consistently maintains he did those things unwittingly. And there, of course, lies the difference between the classical and Christian meaning of the word hamartia, error in the Greek of Sophocles and Aristotle, sin for St. Paul and the Gospels, the former including guilt, certainly culpa, but excluding the involvement of awareness and will. After hearing him out, the chorus show compassion and grants hospitality, which is confirmed by Theseus, who hastens to Colonus as soon as he hears that Oedipus is there. Athens, the city of law, must enforce the law in its own territory, and no one shall be allowed to harm Oedipus and his daughters. When, shortly afterwards, Creon, Oedipus's brother-in-law and ruler now in Thebes, comes to invite the former king to return home and kidnaps Antigone and Ismene to force Oedipus to follow him, Theseus pursues him and frees the 2 girls. Polynices also comes to Colonus for Oedipus's blessing in a struggle against his brother Eteocles, but his father curses him, forcing him to leave. At this point, the war between the 2 brothers has started, and they're drawing warriors from all over Greece. Oedipus has thus come to terms with and successfully defended his past. We feel he's presented as the scapegoat of destiny and universal guilt, as the suppliant of the Eumenides, as indeed, Sophocles says, someone sacred, someone filled with piety and power, bearing a great gift for the people of Athens. The second part of the play can now begin. Oedipus is in Colonus, and listen to what Sophocles says, or has the chorus say about Colonus. Glistening, brilliant in the sun, where the nightingale sings on, her dying music rising clear, hovering always, never leaving, down the shadows deepening green, she haunts the glades, the wine-dark ivy, dense and dark the untrodden, sacred wood of God, rich with laurel and olives, never touched by the sun, untouched by storms that blast from every quarter. Here strides Dionysus, followed by dancing nymphs. Here bloom Crocus and Narcissus, crown of Demeter and Persephone, the 2 goddesses of the Eleusinian mysteries, which promise their initiates a blessed existence beyond the grave. There is ever quickening life. Here in the waters of the river Cevisus, and Aphrodite, and the Muses dwell here. 2 extraordinary marvels are also present, a creation self-creating that grows to greatness, the grey-leafed olive, mother, nurse of children, gift of Athena, and the glory of horses bestowed by Poseidon, god of the sea lanes, he whose ship flies like a marvel past the land, his long flashing oars whipping the sea, mounting the white mains of the sea, racing the sea nymphs, dancing past the prow. Colonus and Athens are not just random places. They are sacred and divine, shine with mystery and life and death, smell of animals and flowers and trees, extend over land and sea. This is where Oedipus has come and where he must die. Colonus is a holy threshold, wonderful and disturbing. It prefigures, with its grove of the Eumenides, the dark life of Hades, as well as what can only be read as a passage to ton aie bioton, is the expression, life forever, or perhaps eternal life. There are two moments of this in the second section of the play. First, as thunder sounds several times in the distance, Oedipus understands the destined end has come. He sends for Theseus, and when the ruler of Athens arrives, Oedipus announces great mysteries and says they shall be revealed only to him, Theseus, in token of Oedipus's unfailing protection of Athens. As he feels the god within him urge him on, Oedipus advances, now relying on his strength alone, leading his children and Theseus. Until then, of course, he had been led because he was blind. He bids farewell to the light of the sun, while the chorus prays to Persephone, Hades, and the Furies. Then he leaves the stage. At this point, the second stage opens up. A messenger picks up the story and announces that Oedipus is gone. Gone. Dead, the chorus asks. The messenger answers with the phrase I already quoted, passed to eternal life, or to ton bioton, aie bioton. He then proceeded to a steep descent in a hollow between rocks, sat down, loosed his filthy rags, and asked his daughters to fetch fresh spring water for him. They bathed him in it, and then dressed him up in shining linen, the custom for the dead. When Zeus once more thundered from the depths, and Antigone and Ismene shuddered and cried, Oedipus flung his arms around them both and said, "My children, this is the day that ends your father's life. All that I was on earth is gone. No longer will you bear the heavy burden of caring for your father. It was hard, I know, my children, but one word alone repays you for the labor of your lives. Love, my children. You had love from me as from no other man alive, and now you must live without me all your days to come." Deep silence ensued. Then a voice was heard crying out, You there, Oedipus, what are we waiting for? You hold us back too long. We must move on, move on." Knowing it was the god that called him on, the messenger says, Oedipus turned to Theseus and implored him never to abandon his children. Then exhorted Antigone and Ismene to leave. Only the appointed one, Theseus, must see the mystery, he said. And those were the last words he spoke. A minute later, he disappeared. Only Theseus was visible now, shielding his eyes as if something terrible was flashing before him, and he could not bear to look. He bent down and kissed the ground, praying at once to the gods of Olympus and the earth. But by what doom Oedipus died, the messenger concludes, not a man alive can say, save Theseus, our king. No blazing bolt of the god took him off, nor whirlwind sweeping inland off the seas. Not in his last hour, no. It was some escort sent by the gods, or the dark world of the dead, the lightless depths of earth bursting open in kindness to receive him. That man went on his way, I tell you, not with train of mourners, nor with suffering or with sickness, no. If the death of any mortal was ever won, his departure was a marvel. A few instants later, when Antigone and Ismene returned, chanting a dirge, the chorus asked them if Oedipus is really gone. Antigone confirms the taumastos, the wonder the messenger has witnessed. She adds that neither war nor the crashing waves struck down her father, but he was snatched away by the fields unseen, swept away by a strange, swift doom. There is wonder here, there's always wonder on the lips of Antigone. We heard yesterday that Michael Paul was in love with that passage in Sophocles' Antigone, in fact, talking about the many wonders. 30 years before, Oedipus Rex had staged, amongst other things, the tragic conflict between the knowledge of the seer Tiresias and the rational one of Oedipus. The pride the latter felt in promoting rational research of the truth had ended up in disaster when the detective discovered that he himself was the criminal. That conflict and that pride has disappeared in Oedipus at Colonus. But by giving up his rational knowledge, Oedipus, now holding the inscrutable, with an I, a capital I think it should be, in himself and in his destiny, has gained the status of sacred mystagogue. He is the mystery and the proposer of mysteries. He is victim and savior. Of course, he neither forgets nor forgives, nor indeed does he ask to be forgiven. Rather, he defends and absolves himself. But he finds love for his daughters, and the recognition of that philein is one of the crucial and most moving moments of the play. This new Oedipus dies surrounded by wonder. He dies, no question about it, fulfilling the oracle's prophecy in the grove of the Eumenides in Colonus. He dies in the strangest and most wonderful fashion, snatched away by the fields unseen of Hades. He passes to a kind of life forever. And the actual moment of his passing away is presented as a sort of invisible, dark, and numinous transfiguration, something terrible, the word is deinos, radiating from him, which makes Theseus shield his eyes with his hands. Oedipus's dying is deep, deeper than any kind of dying we might have seen from Homer onwards. It is thaumastos, wonder, marvel, miraculum. Perhaps one should point out that this approach to death is so consolatory that it is not surprising the Athenians rejected Paul's teaching of the Kerygma when he preached in their Areopagus. Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus was finally staged in 401 BC by his nephew. 2 years later, the philosopher Socrates was found guilty by the Athenian tribunal both of corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens and of impiety, not believing in the gods of the state was the formal accusation, and condemned to death. Socrates accepted the sentence, went to prison, drank the poison hemlock, and died. Plato recounts the whole story in 3 of his dialogues, the Apology of Socrates, the Crito, and the Phaedo. And Socrates' actual death takes place at the end of the 3rd, Phaedo. But the theme of death runs through all the 3 dialogues from the moment the death sentence is pronounced. At the end of the Apology, Socrates addresses the judges who have just condemned him. He says he expected the death penalty and goes on maintaining that this is not necessarily a bad result. As a matter of fact, he thinks it is a blessing and goes on to explain that death is one of 2 things. Either, he says, it is annihilation and the dead have no consciousness of anything, or it is really a change, a migration of the soul from this place to another. Well, if it is annihilation and loss of consciousness, then it is, he says, a marvelous gain, because the whole of time can be regarded as one single night of rest and sleep, dreamless sleep. If, on the other hand, death implies a removal to another place, and we believe ancient legend, then again this must be the greatest blessing. Imagine, he says, encountering the true jurors, Minos, Rhadamanthus, Aeacus, and Triptolemus, after having dealt with these so-called jurors. Here he's telling the judges themselves, so you can imagine the effect. Think how wonderful, he says, it would be meeting Orpheus and Musaeus, Hesiod and Homer, Agamemnon and Odysseus. Their company and conversation, like the chance to examine them, would be unimaginable happiness, like the chance to examine them because he would go on asking questions even after death, of course, even of these people. Socrates resorts to archaic conceptions of Hades, to the view of myth and poetry. He does so again at the end of Phaedo, just before dying, when, expounding his view of the universe, he reaches the other world. He looks at death with the eyes of imagination, one of the springboards that Michael Paul Gallagher points to in his last book, Into Extra Time. But Socrates is not done yet. He ends his address to the jurors by taking leave with his famous phrase, "Well, now it is time to be off, I to die and you to live. But which of us has the happier prospect? It is unknown to anyone but God or the God." The second dialogue, Crito, does not bear directly on the question of death, but rather on the problem of what it might be right to do in the case of a death sentence. Socrates is now in prison and is being visited by one of his disciples, Crito. Crito encourages Socrates to flee from Athens. He and his friends could bribe the guards and get him off. After all, the judges were wrong and the sentence unjust. Socrates refuses, developing an argument based on his respect for the law. He has, he says, freely signed a pact with the laws of Athens. What would they, the laws, say if he now broke it simply because he's been unjustly condemned to death? Socrates stays on in jail, serenely waiting for death. And the question, even in ancient Greece, would appear to be more complex than this, as Sophocles' Antigone had shown 40 years before with its debate on the conflict between natural law, natural and divine law, the law that prompts Antigone to bury her brother Polynices, and the law of the state, which by Creon's decree forbids just that. You should not bury your beloved ones, your brother. Although the two cases are different, the dilemma of what to do when the law is unjust is still relevant today after what we've seen in Germany and in the Soviet Union in the 30s, and indeed as Hegel's discussion of Antigone witnesses. Yet Socrates is unique in his sticking to the law of Athens. Of course, Jesus too abides by the law after an unjust death sentence, but his reasons for doing so are more numerous than the mere respect for the law. There is, for instance, the sense that his mission must be accomplished and that the scriptures must be fulfilled, as when, at the beginning of the Passion in Gethsemane, he reproaches the disciple who draws his sword against a servant of the high priest, saying, "Thinkest thou that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he shall presently give me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then shall the scriptures be fulfilled, that thus it must be?" Of course, in Socrates' case, there's no question of asking, his father to bring legions of angels, but Crito could bribe the guards. Socrates remains in jail. The day of his death approaches. When it comes, he spends some time explaining to Cebes why he has lately composed lyrics by adapting Aesop's fables and the Prelude to Apollo, then explains why the philosopher avoids suicide but welcomes death. Death frees man from the body and is therefore the culmination of a life's work in search of wisdom, because the body hinders the philosopher in his attempt at understanding the ideas, with a capital I at this point, because it is Plato, of course, the ideas of things. A very Platonic Socrates, we are now in the Phaedo, and Plato himself is physically absent, due, as he writes, to illness on the last day of Socrates' life. So Socrates launches now into the argument from opposites, the theory of recollection, and the argument from affinity, to proceed finally to the existence of an afterlife, the nature of the universe, and the immortality of the soul. Socrates echoes and at times teases the theories of the pre-Socratic thinkers, such as Empedocles, Anaximenes, and Heraclitus, approves of some of the ideas of his older contemporary Anaxagoras, and, like the character who spoke to the jurors in the Apology, employs mythic material, even Orphic tales of the afterlife. Tartarus, Oceanus, Acheron, Styx, Periplegeton, Cocytus, all the names of rivers and places of the other world one can find in poetry, and above all in the Odyssey, are mentioned here. The newly dead, Socrates maintains, are judged immediately after dying and sent to their appropriate destinations. Those who have lived a neutral life are dispatched to the Acheron, and crossing it reach the Acherusian lake, where they dwell undergoing purification. They who have committed incurable sins are hurled into Tartarus, from whence they emerge no more. But human beings who have lived a life of surpassing holiness are allowed to live on the earth's surface, and those who have purified themselves by philosophy will live without bodies and will reach habitations of ineffable beauty. Of course, Socrates adds, no reasonable man ought to insist that the facts are exactly as I've described them, but that either this or something very like it is a true account of our souls and their future habitations, since there is certainly evidence that the soul is deathless. This, I think, is both a fitting contention and a belief worth risking. For the risk is a noble one. We should use such accounts to enchant ourselves with, and this is why I have already drawn out my tale so long, he says. At this point, Socrates tells his disciples they will all sooner or later make this journey. For him, however, the time is now. He must take a bath before drinking the poison, because he would prefer the women not to have the trouble of washing him when he's dead. And it is in this mood that he prepares himself and his disciples to his death. When Crito asks him how he would like to be buried, he replies, "Any way you like. That is, if you can catch me and I don't slip through your fingers," and laughs gently. Crito, Socrates says, hasn't understood a word of his explanation. I am Socrates, this Socrates here who is talking to you now. He thinks I am the corpse he will soon see. But I shall not be that corpse. I promised Athens I would stay in prison and not flee, as Crito wanted me to. But after death, I shall depart and be gone instantly. Bury my body in whatever way you think is most proper. I don't care. Socrates, followed by Crito, goes into another room to bathe, while the others wait for him to return. After the bath, his two little sons and his one big boy and his women are brought in, and he gives them directions about carrying out his wishes, sends them away, and joins his disciples once more. He only talks for a few minutes when, just before sunset, the prison officer enters to warn the time for drinking the hemlock has come. The officer is both apologetic and embarrassed. He has learned to appreciate Socrates as the noblest and the gentlest and the bravest of all men that have ever been in this prison. And he's sure Socrates will not be angry with him. He says goodbye and bursts into tears as he turns to go. Socrates says goodbye to him and then tells his disciples what a nice man the officer has been throughout. Finally, he asks Crito to have the poison brought in. And Crito begins by replying that no, the sun is still high on the mountains, and besides, other people have enjoyed dinner, wine, and the company of those whom they loved long after receiving the warning. Socrates has but to reply that there is no reason for delay, that he will gain nothing by drinking the poison a little later, and that he would make himself ridiculous in his own eyes if he clung to life. And Crito obeys. A man whom Socrates asks for instructions brings in the poison. He just asks to drink it and then walk about until he feels the weight in his legs. At that point he should lie down and the poison will work of its own accord. He hands the cup to Socrates, who receives it quite cheerfully and without any change of color or expression, asks to be permitted to pour a libation with the drink itself. No, there is no extra liquid for that, replies the god bureaucratically. We only prepare the normal dose. Socrates nevertheless prays the gods to grant him a prosperous removal from this to the other world, and as he pronounces his prayer, he drains the cup in one gulp, calmly and with no apparent sign of distaste. The disciples, unable to hold themselves any longer, burst into tears. Socrates reproaches them humorously. Really, my friends, what a way to behave. Why, that was my main reason for sending away the women, to prevent this sort of discordant behavior, because I'm told that one should make one's end in reverent silence. Calm yourselves and be brave. They regain their composure. Socrates, feeling his legs get heavy, lies down. The man who had brought in the poison pinches his feet and legs and keeps his hand over him. Everyone can see that Socrates' body is gradually going cold and numb. When the coldness reaches his waist, Socrates uncovers his face and tells Crito, we ought to offer a cock to Aesculapius. See to it, and don't forget. Are you sure there is nothing else? Crito asks. There's no reply. Then Socrates stirs, the man uncovers him, and his eyes are fixed. Crito closes mouth and eyes. This, says Phaedo, who's been telling the story from the beginning, this, Echecrates, was the end of our comrade, who was, we may fairly say, of all those whom we knew in our time, the bravest and also the wisest and the most just. How many times have I read this story? For me, the first time must have been over 50 years ago in high school, and some of it, the Apology, I seem to remember, we did in Greek. Still, it never fails to move me. The trial and death of Socrates must have been quite momentous already in Athens at the end of the 5th century, as Xenophon's version of the Apology testifies. But what is more is that Plato, the absent disciple, writes them down with a perfect sense of drama, as if he were Sophocles composing Oedipus at Colonus. First come the trial and the first sounding of the death theme. Then we have the Crito, where death is only in the background. Finally, in the Phaedo, Plato presents the long argument for the immortality of the soul and Socrates' actual death in perfect counterpoint. The only thing Xenophon adds to our theme is that in leaving the jurors, his Socrates tells his weeping friends, haven't you known all along that from the moment I was born, nature had condemned me to death? It is better to die now, Xenophon, Socrates maintains, than living with the hardships of old age. Plato's Socrates, as we've seen, is far more articulate. His first step is to tell the judges, one can imagine how they must take it, that either death means the end of everything, or it opens the door to the other world, which, as myth and traditional religion would have it, must be a happier one than ours. From the point of view of rational, philosophical discourse, I still don't know of a better answer to the problem that torments all human beings. Yet it is clear that from the end itself of his trial, Socrates' inclination is to dwell on the other world rather than total annihilation. Once he decides to stay in Athens and accept the death penalty, for which the Crito provides rational justification, Socrates moves towards the deathless life of the other world. The closer he gets to dying, the more he speaks of immortality of the soul. True, this is increasingly Plato's Socrates, as the allusions to the ideas in the Phaedo prove, rather than, so to speak, Socrates' Socrates. But the argument on the immortality of the soul in that dialogue clearly is one that Socrates himself might have developed, or did in fact develop. It is a rational argument based on pure logos, and one which I would maintain still holds. Socrates proves rationally that the soul of human beings is immortal, full stop. But it is at this point that he enters the realm of mythos, the word he himself uses, of a discourse that is not necessarily the factual truth, but very like it. Socrates is willing to, as it were, suspend disbelief. As a matter of fact, he says that this is a belief worth risking, and that the risk is a noble one. Actually, the original has kalos, a beautiful risk. Earlier on, he had told his friends that in order to exercise the fear of death, they should pronounce an enchantment over him, over death, every day, until they have charmed his fears away. Now he proclaims that we all should use such accounts, i.e. the mythical ones, to enchant ourselves with. Risk and enchantment are the kind of thing one would associate with Oedipus at Colonus rather than with Socrates, yet here they are. Belief in the other world of tradition is worth risking, and the risk itself is beautiful. We should let ourselves be enchanted by the vision of this status animarum post mortem. And this is not exactly a small point, both per se and because it connects with Christian belief. In the Convivio, for instance, let alone the comedy, Dante shows a very similar attitude. The account is not without pathos. Its intensity derives from the fact that his women and disciples, and we with them, suffer and weep, while Socrates smiles in utter calm. But what I think hits the reader of those scenes is their simplicity and homeliness, the serenity that emerge from their perfect dramatic orchestration. Socrates appears throughout as a tranquil, even, as I said several times, humorous man, devoted to reason and myth, able to comfort his friends as well as the jailer, a man who has, as it were, digested death long before dying. Socrates dives deeper into death than anyone we know before him. He dies deeper. Of course, no physical pain is present. Had Socrates been tortured or crucified, things might have been different. Almost 500 years after him, another philosopher was, as Tacitus tells us in his Annals, condemned to death, this time without trial and without judges. Seneca's death sentence was issued by the Emperor Nero, whose teacher and advisor he had been, and was brought to him by a centurion. It was a privilege of the Roman upper classes to be offered the choice of committing suicide instead of being beheaded by an executioner. Seneca accepted. He asked for the tablets containing his will. The centurion stopped him. The philosopher then turned to his friends and called, I'm quoting Tacitus now, and called them to witness that as he was prevented from showing his gratitude for their services, he left them his sole but fairest possession, the image of his life. If they bore it in mind, they would reap the reward of their loyal friendship in the credit accorded to virtue's accomplishments. At the same time, he recalled them from tears to fortitude, sometimes conversationally, sometimes in sterner, almost coercive tones. Where, he asked, were the maxims of your philosophy? Where that reasoned attitude towards impending evils which they had studied through so many years? For to whom had Nero's cruelty been unknown? Nor was anything left him after the killing of his mother and his brother, but to add the murder of his guardian and preceptor. End of quotation. Referring to the Stoic and Epicurean attitudes to death he had propounded in his letters to Lucilius, basically, he who learns to die learns to be free, Seneca and his wife cut a slit in their arms. Seneca's body, however, is old and thin, and the blood coming out of his veins is too slow. So he also cuts the arteries in the legs and behind the knee. Exhausted by the racking pains, he persuades his wife to withdraw to another room. She is subsequently reprieved by Nero, calls his secretaries and dictates a long speech. Still, not enough blood is oozing out of his emaciated body. He asks a friend to bring a cup of hemlock, the poison that had killed Socrates, and drinks it at once, but to no avail, because his limbs are already cold, and his system, Tacitus writes, closed to the action of the drug. Seneca then gets into a tub of hot water, sprinkling the slaves around him, and saying he's offering the liquid as a libation to Jove the Liberator. Finally, he is lifted into a bath and suffocated by the vapor. He is cremated on the spot without ceremony. Seneca's aged body simply refuses to die, as it were, artificially. It is so naturally close to death that it eludes death. Nothing works for him, not even the example of Socrates, whom he would gladly imitate. His suicide is devastated by pain. It is indeed pure torture, yet he bears it all patiently, almost lightly. If it were not so typically stoic, one could say it resembles Christ's passion. I don't know, and no one knows, I think, if Tacitus had read the Gospels. But the account of Seneca's death comes, in his annals, only 20 chapters after that of Nero's persecution of the Christians, after the fire that destroyed most of central Rome in July 64. In order to scotch a rumor that he himself had initiated the fire, Nero, Tacitus recounts, accused the Christians. Here's the passage. Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the deceased, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. First, then, the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson as for hatred of the human race. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beasts' skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Nero had offered his gardens for the spectacle, and gave an exhibition in his circus, mixing with the crowd in the habit of a charioteer or mounted on his car. Hence, in spite of a guilt which had earned the most exemplary punishment, there arose a sentiment of pity due to the impression that they, the Christians, were being sacrificed not for the welfare of the state, but to the ferocity of a single man. Tacitus has no sympathy for the Christians and shares his contemporaries' prejudices about them. But faithful to his intention to narrate history sine ira et studio, without anger and without partiality, he relates the death of the Christians in all its crudity and cruelty, and records the arousal of pity towards them among the citizens of Rome. Presumably it is this incipient compassion, miseratio, Tacitus calls it, that draws an increasing number of Romans to the new religion. Stoicism and Epicureanism, the pillars of Seneca's ethics, remain doctrines for the few. Christianity spread like the great fire of Rome. To find the two of them and their respective martyrdoms side by side in Tacitus's account of Nero's reign makes quite an impression. Yet Seneca was for quite some time considered by Christians as their close friend and ally. Tertullian speaks of him as a writer who is often one of ours. Lactantius opines Seneca could have been a true devotee of God if someone had shown God to him. A correspondence between St. Paul and Seneca was even invented in the 4th century AD, in the course of which Seneca speaks of the Christians accused of the fire, precisely with the miseratio mentioned by Tacitus. Things are getting worse as we go on in time. So the death of these people of these philosophers gets constantly more gruesome, as it were. Seneca was not the last thinker to be put to death by a ruling monarch. Almost 500 years after him, go from 500 years to 500 years, in 524 AD, the Christian philosopher Boethius was executed in Pavia by order of Theodoric, king of Italy, but as you know, an Ostrogoth. He knew he was but the latest in a sequence that had started a long time before. At the beginning of the consolation of philosophy, philosophy tells him, but even if you had never heard of Anaxagoras' banishment from Athens, or Socrates, drinking the hemlock, or the torture of Zeno, all of which happened abroad, surely you would know about such Romans as Canius and Seneca and Soranus, whose stories are neither so old nor from so far away. And the only cause of their deaths was their dedication to me, this philosophy, and their indifference to and contempt for the beliefs and pursuits of wicked men that my teaching had instilled in them. People who have not read the Consolation think that it is meant as a consolation for Boethius' impending death, but it is not. Death is lamented only in the very first meter of the book, when Boethius sings that to the young death is a threat to their pleasures, but now that I'm worn down and out, and it offers at last a remission of all my pains, it is cruel, paying no heed to my imploring cries, and will not deign to close my weeping eyes. Later in the Consolation, Boethius complains of having been condemned unjustly and defends himself against the accusations that brought him to trial. But he knows very well indeed, that the minds, mentes, of human beings are immortal. And philosophy reminds him of that while speaking about happiness. Boethius needs no consolation on account of death. What he needs is a consolation for problems he has encountered in the course of his meditations on the nature of things: happiness, the good, God, wickedness, fate, providence, chance, divine prescience, predestination, contingency, and eternity. He needs a rational explanation of how the universe works and of how humans are free to conform to its rhythm. And he does indeed receive this explanation. Philosophy is there precisely for that purpose. Philosophy, not theology. Boethius is a Christian, yet philosophy's arguments are mainly Platonic, her reasoning Aristotelian, her images informed by pagan poetry. Just a couple of examples. When, in meter 9 of book 3, O Qui Perpetua, she sings the harmony of the cosmos, one can trace the sources of inspiration fairly clearly. He who rules the universe with perpetual reason, who sows heaven and earth and bids time move, is an Aristotelian unmoved mover, stabilisque manens das puncta moveri. Yet at the same time, he who shapes flowing matter draws out all things from a model, exemplo, like Plato's demiurge, and beautiful in himself, like Plotinus's one, bears in his mind a beautiful world. For a man who was about to die and wrote his book in prison, this is quite impressive. Boethius was consoling not so much himself, but humankind. He was also going much further than Socrates and Seneca, while using purely pagan philosophy to expound Christian theology. He was dying, to go back to my theme, much more deeply than his predecessors. For all this, he was cudgeled to death. The likeliest account of his execution, recorded by the Ravenna Chronicle, reports that a cord was twisted around his head so tightly that it caused his eyeballs to protrude from their sockets, and that his life was then beaten out of him by a club. Theodoric was a Christian, an Arian, and had been educated as Roman in Constantinople, but he and his men remained Ostrogoth, or German, one should say. The further we have advanced in our account of dying deeper, the more gruesome the way of dying has become, in passing from civilized Athens to less civilized imperial Rome to uncivilized, if Christian, Pavia. Of course, one could have mentioned plenty of Greek or indeed Senecan tragedies where dying is horrible. But after Oedipus, my concern was with the death of philosophers, i.e., of those whom classical antiquity thinks are the best of men. I have duly noted the differences and the similarities between these pagan accounts and the Christian ones. I am aware I have left out the Christian story par excellence, that of the Passion. I would like to examine that soon, but in another paper. And in any case, many people in the past have compared the death of Socrates and that of Jesus. I merely wish to sketch a pre-Christian view of dying deeper. That of Oedipus and that of Socrates in many ways look like intuition chrétienne, but also tell us why the citizens of Athens rejected Paul's message from the Areopagus. If you have such luminous examples of dying and belief in eternal life, why should you accept a new one? One that adds resurrection of the flesh to immortality of the soul. Yet perhaps there is a link between the pagan attitude towards death I've described and that of a Christian like Michael Gallagher. Socrates' awareness of his guard's gentleness, his care to keep his sons and the weeping women away from his deathbed, can be seen not only as an attempt to face death unemotionally, but to admit that those who love him will feel pain and express it emotionally, but also wish to keep this in what he considers its proper place. We remember, too, that Oedipus expressed love for his daughters before his death in Oedipus at Colonus, thus highlighting the importance of love. Michael, as I called him, Michael Paul, too, in his quiet way, expressed his love for his friends by not wanting to burden them with the knowledge that he had given up chemo and was taking only palliative drugs, as he points out into Extra Time, as they would know that this meant they would soon lose him. He tried to keep this knowledge from them as long as possible. Thank you.